a bunch of you know Seashore, and anybody here visited Seashore in the past year? Okay, you just arrived. Hope you had a good time. What's new at Seashore? Why would you want to go there again? Well, we don't have any new equipment. We have got Eastern Mass 4387 out and running in regular service now. The Eastern Mass Street Railroad was one of those that either our grandparents or our parents or maybe ourselves might have ridden back in the day. This car ran in the last service from Boston out to Stoneham, the Elm via Fellsway service. Now, have you driven in Route 93 to Boston through the Fells? That's the open park-like area where you come, and then before you come down the steep slope where you can see off in the far distance the Prue and the Hancock, and between them and you the giant traffic jam. Okay, so yeah, I have some ex-commuters here, maybe even some current commuters. So it ran Elm via Fellsway. If you're new to the area and you look right, because you're stopped in traffic when you're along there, there's two places you'll see concrete bridges that were the route of this Elm via Fellsway trolley line. It had maybe 2 miles of private right-of-way up there. One of them is a nice low arch, and the other one is a concrete pier bridge, which with steel inside, and so it's spalling, and eventually it's going to fall down, but the concrete arch may outlive my kids. I don't know. The concrete arches were much better built than the reinforced bridges, which came later. So 4387 is new and out, and we're restoring B&M 500. That runs now, but it doesn't have paint. B&M 500 was a Fairmont gas car that was built for the engineering department. The Main Central had one that was similar, and the engineering department would send out a crew with surveying instruments and so on and so forth, and it would putter down the line and stop, and it's rather heavy to actually take off at a set-off. And the story on B&M 500 coming to Seashore was the senior people at the B&M who wanted to donate it got in it at Boston Engine Terminal and putt all the way up the line to Biddeford, where it was taken off with the motor still running, carried to Seashore, unloaded, and run on a Seashore track. I'm not sure if this meant they had no battery. That's often a situation in railroad preservation. So that needs paint. And the subtext of all of this is that, money helps things happen up at Seashore. So if you are feeling charitable towards Seashore, we always welcome help, membership, donations towards specific projects, and so forth. So let's go to the next slide. That's our foundation car. Next slide. And once upon a time, there were a lot of trolleys around here. Is this going to work for me for next slide or? Okay, now I have to figure out which way is forward. No, that's forward. Good. Okay, so does anybody here feel they are fairly familiar with the history of trolleys around here? Okay, so I'll tell you how you get familiar. O.R. Cummings, remember his name. When you see an O.R. Cummings book, it is almost always worth buying. This one is Trolleys to the Casino, Exeter, Hampton, and Amesbury Street Railroad. And in fact, it did run from Exeter to Hampton and then back to Amesbury. And if anybody know Amesbury well enough to know where Clinton Street is? Okay, that building, the factory building, that's now the furniture factory, or maybe just the furniture warehouse out on Clinton Street, that was the car barn for the EH&A. And anybody know Merrimack, Massachusetts? Drive down Route 110. Know the Merrimack Firehouse? The Merrimack Firehouse was the car barn for the Haverhill and Amesbury Street Railroad. But then we get to the Portsmouth Electric Railway, also Mr. Cummings, and the Portsmouth Electric Railway ran right out here on Route 108. It did a bunch of other things too, but that's the thing that's relevant today. Pardon? Yeah, yeah. And let's see, my own local trolley story is that when my great-grandfather wanted to come visit my grandparents, who had just moved into the house that I live in now in Southampton, he lived in Wilton, New Hampshire, and he didn't have a car. So how would he get from Wilton, New Hampshire to Southampton, New Hampshire? Well, he could take the B&M to Nashua. And if he was in Nashua and he continued with the B&M for a reasonable schedule, he'd have to go into Boston on the line through Lowell, and then he would come out of Boston, probably on the eastern route, because not many trains stopped at Powwow River. That's where route, if you know the area, that's where Route 107A goes over the route of the Downeaster. And not many trains stopped in East Kingston either, which is the grade crossing by the general store. So by train, he'd come out to Newburyport, catch a streetcar to Amesbury, or he could wait for one of the occasional trains that ran from Newburyport to Amesbury, because I think there still were a few then. But the thing is, the railroad's charged by the mile. So he'd pay for the ride into Boston, he'd pay for the ride out. So what do you think he did? Anybody seen the pictures in the entrance of Canobie Lake Park? Okay. Well, Canobie Lake Park happened to be a trolley park, and it was because it was a trolley park that they built in large part to get business on Sundays, taking people out of the city when nobody was going to work. They had to run the service, but they wanted to promote real estate and also have entertainment out there so that they could get people to ride all the way to the end of the line. And they called those open cars, like our foundation car, Biddeford and Saco 31, they called them breezers. And why do you think that was? Well, I always say it when I'm operating a streetcar. If it's a hot day, I say, okay, the air conditioning will start when there's two bells, because then we start moving and there's moving air. And that was a great thing in 1900, because there weren't electric fans. Cities were still heat islands. They were hotter and the air was usually kind of still, particularly in the single floor apartments. So people would just ride the trolley car. For a nickel, they could get a breeze, and they liked that. So my great-grandfather rather, would catch the car from Nashua to Canobie Lake Park, but he wouldn't go into Canobie Lake Park. He'd catch the car from Canobie Lake Park to Haverhill, and then in Haverhill, he'd get on the Haverhill, Plastow, and Newton, which is something that you can actually see private right-of-way on if you drive Route 108 through Newton, at the place where you make the sharp curve, and there's the yellow blinker. You can see roadbed off to one side, and there was about a mile or so of private right-of-way there, and most of the roadbed is still intact. And if you dig it up on the internet, a fellow actually figured out where the private right-of-way cut from about the Hen House pub on 108 over to Plastow. Now there was another 2 or 3 miles of private right-of-way there. So he would ride the Haverhill, Plastow, and Newton right to the one little corner of Southampton it went through, and then he'd walk 2 miles and he'd be at my grandparents' house. And it would cost him, once he, I don't know the railroad fare, but once he got on the trolleys, it had probably cost him under $1. And it was the fastest way you would ever been able to get from Wilton to Southampton in as of 1919. Of course, the trolley line was abandoned in 1920, so he had to buy a car if he was going to come visit. So the relevance here is that Seashore started by preserving a car from the Biddeford and Saco Railroad, which lasted until 1939, operating within Biddeford. And it runs on the roadbed of the old Atlantic shoreline, which, this is another, maybe you've noticed it, but at the south edge of near the south edge of Wells in Maine, if you're on Route 1, there's one of those places where it really dips down and comes back up again because there's a river crossing there. And you notice there's an old road that goes further up, so they had to do less filling. And you can, if you look right in the right place, you can see a concrete bridge there. And that was where the Atlantic Shoreline built their own bridge because the highway bridge wasn't strong enough. So the Atlantic Shoreline ran from Biddeford to Kittery. And this book has all the details in it. And we got a piece of the private right-of-way of the Atlantic Shoreline. Lots of trolleys, lots of interesting old trolleys. When I first visited San Francisco, there was 2 trolley tracks in the middle, but 4 sets of trolley bus wire on Market Street. And there's Biddeford and Saco in Biddeford. There's our museum's historic declaration there. And we decided, since we had lots of land, that we would do a collection of all kinds of streetcars from as many different places as we could. That's the one that's running in Lowell right now. Point, yep, 966. I operated that 2 weeks ago. That one, I'm not even sure where 1887 is. That one's the Dallas car, and that its bolster failed. We had run it longer in museum service than it had run for Dallas Railway. And when we took that truck apart, oh boy, the repairs they'd done on it, you know, weld after weld after weld. It's one of those 21E trucks where there's the little axle and the big axle, and the big axle is the one that has the motor on it, so it slips like fury on a wet day. Well, that'll get repaired eventually. There's your Chicago Surface Lines car. So you have a lot of different trolleys. And let's see, I've talked about the electric railroads. Now, everybody's heard the story of how at one point, about 1914 or 15, you started to be able to go from Waterville, Maine to Kittery on trolleys. And then you had to walk across the bridge because they never built the first bridge wasn't strong enough to carry the trolleys. And by the time the Memorial Bridge, recently deceased, was built, it was strong enough, but the trolley company didn't have enough money to put the tracks across it. So you had to walk across at Portsmouth. Then you could ride streetcars to Hampton, to Newburyport, to Boston, to Worcester, to Springfield, to Pittsfield, to Chatham, to Albany. Albany, you could make it as far as Little Falls on the Mohawk. The streetcars stopped there for 12 miles. So you take the New York Central 12 miles, and then you could ride electric single car operation all the way to Iowa from wherever the eastern edge of the Utica lines were. So that's what there was at the beginning of World War I. And then everything changed because the automobile got cheap, and so only memories of it are left. When I was a kid, there was one rail in the concrete of Main Street in Amesbury, which was the one that had been laid in concrete as opposed to the edge of the concrete. And that was from the Newburyport and Amesbury Street Railway route, which lasted until 1930. My parents rode the streetcars. That was the only thing I ever saw of them. And other than the pieces of roadbed, just about all the reminders of the streetcars are gone from around here. The roadbed and the car barns. The car barns were well built. We actually helped the Merrimack Fire Department with by finding the plans for that car barn in Merrimack, Massachusetts, so they could be sure just what they were doing when they turned it into the firehouse. Lots and lots of them. So let's see, I think that's about all I need from this set. This is our the line car we have in service right now. That platform is actually well enough insulated that I have been up there helping somebody heave on a 600-volt wire to get it back into place, because there were streetcars on the line and we couldn't shut off the power. So I wasn't the first one to touch it, but okay. If it didn't blow up for him. Okay. So now I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about and get towards the model railroad building, because I've really only used about 15 minutes of the 45 I was asked to talk. If this starts to be excessively burdensome to you, start waving your hands or giving me thumbs down or something like that. So once upon a time, a rich guy, probably, I'm guessing, probably in the $100 million range. Oh, and is this mic coming in? Okay, okay, just checking. So he saw our city of Manchester, because our city of Manchester is a specialized parlor car. It was actually built in Amesbury, Massachusetts. It isn't on the right truck right now, but the truck that it's on keeps it on the tracks. Being the track superintendent, I care about how wide the wheels are and how deep the flanges are, because if the wheel gets too narrow or the flange wears away to where it's just penciled on, then I can't, I can't keep it on the track. Nobody else could. John Henry couldn't keep it on the track once the flanges are gone. So he saw this. We had this out for an event, and he's the level of millionaire who has a big estate right on the waterfront somewhere in Florida. I believe it's the east side of Florida, so it isn't an ex-estate given recent events. And he thought to himself that, I'd like to have something to shuttle our guests from the main house to the waterfront pavilion and boathouse. And he asked us if we could build one. And we found a truck, and we worked with a boat builder somewhere up country in Maine to build the body. And we built him a replica that's battery powered, and it shuttles back and forth from the main house to the waterfront house. And so he was relatively rich. And then now we get to the story of the Beals family. Buzz Beals, I think his name was Harold. Let me check my notes, because he passed some time back.
James, are you done with the slides?
I'm done with these, but now I want to shift to the presentation about the Maine Central Model Railroad, the other one that I gave you. So a husband and wife lived in Jonesport, and it doesn't sound like he ever actually worked for the railroad, but he was very interested in railroads. Yep, that's the one. And so he and his wife built a model railroad in their garage. And it had a lot of custom built structures by her. The track, so far as I've seen, tended to be commercial track and like Atlas switches and so on and so forth. And I think the minimum radius was probably 20 to 24 inches. Thank you. 2021 in pictures. This is more about Seashore, but I'll go through that fairly fast. I was too busy doing track in 2021 to even show up in one of these pictures. We do pumpkin patch if you have kids of the age that they'd like to go and get a pumpkin by trolley. We're working on a bunch of restoration projects. We have a genuine B&M transportation bus, something very much from the past. We have a Boston trolley bus, red line car, blue line cars, and the Portland Lewiston Interurban Narcissus. We're all trying to get attention and donations for them.
Are you given these or do you have to buy them?
We almost always have to pay to bring them to Seashore. Sometimes we have to buy them. In the case of the Portland Lewiston Narcissus, I believe what we actually did was we built the owner a new camp and brought the former camp, which was PLI Narcissus, to Seashore. And because it was a camp and because the owner was willing to part for it, you can guess that the underpinnings and so on and so forth had gotten soggy and the corruption had progressed some distance up into the car. Well, it had. And it's a big restoration.
How do you transport these things to the museum?
Well, I could say very carefully, but often, okay, once upon a time, we had these awful home-built trailers. I mean, they worked, but oh, we have one of them sitting by the Highwood car barn with a car sitting up on it. You know, big welded kind of drop center trailers, and there would be some kind of epic multi-day trip to go get the thing loaded onto the trailer somehow and drive it back via whatever routes worked. I mean, let's see, I'm going to go back here a little bit if I can persuade this thing. For some reason,
Keep going.
I was trying to find a picture. Those of you who've been to Seashore know what level of moving stuff to Seashore we've done. You know, you've seen that copper signal tower from Boston Elevated. That came, I think, in 3 pieces, or maybe, no, only 2 pieces. Then, not far from it is the former Northampton station where Mass Ave and Washington Street crossed on the Forest Hills Elevated. And that came on a barge. And so we have a lot of land and we bring stuff. And, you know, we've gotten a lot of donations for things like this, and there's been a lot of kind of crazy volunteer labor. Recently, the things that come to the museum have come with commercial haulers, because there's this company called Silk Road, which has a very good reputation for transporting big, awkward things. And there are some other contractors who compete with them. Yeah, we don't have any photos of Tower C. The former Boston Elevated Tower now has an exhibit in the first floor, so you can go into
There it
it.
is right there.
Okay, yep. That used to be up 20 feet above street level on an elevated structure down just on the south end side of the Mass Pike, where the elevated crossed the Mass Pike. So yeah, we have lots of stuff, and there are sagas of how we got it there. There's movies of how they brought the Northampton station. And the Tower C, one thing that we got was so big that we had to drive it across the tarmac, not actually a runway, but we drove it across the tarmac at Logan Airport to get around those low bridges at the mouth of the tunnel. We barged it to Logan Airport, we drove it across the tarmac, and then it went up Route 1A, and how it made it to Seashore, I don't know, but there was a lot of very careful measuring involved. So anyway, back to the Beals. They had this model railroad. It was in Jonesport. They didn't really advertise it. It wasn't commercial, but I think it was maybe one of the bigger tourist attractions in Jonesport, because if you're not there for the lobster and you're not on your way to Calais, it's not really clear why you might go to Jonesport unless you like really enjoy that ambience of waves breaking on rock and lots of conifers. So anyway, other people liked that ambience, and one of them was a Swiss billionaire named Hans-Jörg Wyss. And let's see, let's go. You're in control of that. Let's go forward till we get to the main Central Model Railroad part. Yep, next slide. Okay, that was the garage that the Beals built their model railroad in. And Hans-Jörg visited them and got to know them. And after Mr. Beals passed on, his wife continued opening up the railroad, but she wasn't really sure, how much longer she'd be able to. And she mentioned that to Hans-Jörg, and Hans-Jörg thought sympathetically and started making things happen. So the first thing that happened was, once I was the Northern New England director for the Northeastern region, and so I represented you folks, and I came to a lot of your board meetings. And then somebody else decided, who was actually a Seacoast division member, decided they would be willing to take up that job. I believe it was Larry Cannon. And I wasn't anymore, but the NER website didn't get updated. And so when the National came saying, we have this inquiry about someone looking for someone who would accept the donation of a model railroad, it wound up, one of the copies of the message wound up in my inbox. And at that point, I was president of the Hub division, but I knew a lot of people in Seacoast, so I started asking around, here's this model railroad, rough dimensions. I've never seen it. It's in Jonesport, and it will be delivered to your site and set up at the billionaire's expense, because he wanted to save it. And bunch of people in Seacoast responded, and a couple even drove up to Jonesport, and some people had operated on it because it had regular operating sessions for a while, but nobody had a building to put it in. And so that kind of fell by the wayside. I reported back, I talked to the agent that Hans-Jörg had engaged to do this, and I said, I find interest, but nobody has a building for it. And so the next year, he had talked to his friend, the billionaire, the rather rich person, but maybe not a billionaire in Florida, who bought the replica of City of Manchester. And the City of Manchester guy said, maybe you could ask Seashore. I know they have a lot of land. And an offer arrived on our executive director's email saying, how would you like this model railroad and a building and staffing for the model railroad for 10 years so that it would be opened? We know you aren't a model railroad museum. And so all the model railroad, all 5 active model railroaders in the museum were rounded up and talked about this. And I said, yeah, this seems genuine, and I know this little bit about it. And so discussions continued. Next slide. This is Helen Beals. Next slide. This is the guy who did the dismantling. He operates out of Lowell. I think he has a collection of people who work for him when he has business of this kind. Next slide. There are a bunch of the structures. To me, in my interest in model railroading, I tend to look for, okay, what is different here? And there's a lot of work in the structures that wasn't kits. And I find that interesting. Next slide. The track, some of it looks pretty good. Some of it looks like we have some emergency repairs. Next slide. It is, as I said, there's a lot of Atlas track in there. But it's an interesting model railroad, and it's always interesting to see what someone does with something like this. So we said yes, and we started designing a building, and we'll get to the building in a bit. The building, I'm out from under the covers as the donor of the new car barn that's going to replace our collapsing South Boston car barn next year. I said, all I'm paying for is a Butler building. I'm not paying for something fancy. With the billion, our president has a friend who's an architect or a designer anyway. And our president presented a considerably fancier building to Hans-Jörg, and Hans-Jörg said, okay. That, of course, was in 2021, and you know everything, particularly buildings, costs more in 2022 and will cost even more in 2023. So there's still a little uncertainty in exactly what the building is going to look like. It has 2 stories. It's going to have a viewing gallery up above. I'm not sure how well that will work with HO scale. The big thing about the layout, and the thing that's possibly of most interest to you all, is that we can't put it together exactly the way it was. Now, I think there's at least one fireman present. Yeah, you aren't going to let a crowd into those aisles, right? Not public, not safe for public access. So we have to expand it. It has to go into a bigger space than the garage. And the way we decided to expand it was it's had to be cut into pieces to transport and store. And we have a plan for it with 5 or 6 new pieces put into it. And one of them, again for the fire marshal, is going to involve a lift bridge. And when the fire alarm goes off, the lift bridge won't move in normal use, but when the fire alarm goes off, the lift bridge is going to go like that and open up a new pathway for people to get out. Next slide.
So you had to cut the whole thing?
It was not, okay. When I kick the bucket, my layout is made so that if there are the biggest pieces will come out the window in my attic if somebody thinks it's worth putting a boom truck out there to catch it when it goes out the window. If they're just sending it like that, it won't be worth much. But this was not done that way. So crated up, put in trucks, carried to A climate controlled, hold it there, Rob, because now we're getting into the new building. Carried into a climate controlled storage facility. I think it's in Kennebunk, so it's within 5 miles of the museum. And there it sits awaiting the building. Now here, if you probably haven't looked at Seashore from the Google view nearly as much as I have, because I have lots of reasons for doing that. This is our visitor center. There's the loop where everybody boards the trolleys. Here are some rapid transit cars that we don't have space for. That's the Long Island MP54, and that's the poor South Shore car. Chicago South Shore and South Bend, they tried to ship it from wherever it was stored to Seashore on rails. And it was routed via Canada, and it went into, I don't know which railroad is to blame, but it went into a hump yard in Canada. And because it was made to go around tight corners, it has pivoting couplers on each end. And when it hit in the hump yard, the coupler at one end was knocked out of it. And so the railroad's response was to put it in the rip track, hoist it off its trucks, torch off all of the stuff on the underbody that prevented them from setting the body on a flat car. And then they found another flat car and they put the trucks on that. And they found a third flat car and they put all the underbody electrical component, the air compressor, etc., on that flat car. And boy, was there hell to pay at customs when something which had left the United States as one antique passenger car running on its own wheels shows up at the border, like probably Island Pond or Newport, Vermont, and is a bunch of components on 3 flat cars. It got resolved. It came to Seashore, and it has never had enough love to get it put together, and the roof is in very bad shape. We think there's someone who thinks they can rehome it out in Indiana, and we will cheerfully send it there. But anyway, there's a tree and there's some open land. There's a lot of ledge under that land, so we're going to find that we have found out exactly how much, and so there's going to be some blasting. Next slide. And here is the building, and we're going to try and save the tree. I'm going to have to really defend that tree, because if they try to ditch too close to its canopy, they'll cut the roots and it will die. There's a lot of ways you can kill a tree where it takes 5 or 10 years to die. Next slide. This is the building we're planning, and this is the way the layout is going to go into it. There's going to be an office and a little store, and we in fact are going to set that up. That's not going to be the same. Oh, sorry, this is the existing conditions. This is the way it was in Jonesport. Next slide. This is what we're going to do. There's going to be a retail area, a conference/workspace, bathrooms, and because the process that I wasn't involved in produced a 2-story building, of course, it's going to have an elevator, which will be the first elevator we own, and it will cost to maintain. So, next slide. This is the 2nd floor gallery. Next slide. That's what it's going to look like from the side. Next slide. That's what it's going to look like from the end. Next slide. That's the perspective view. If I was the donor, I would say that costs about 3 times as much as the minimum. Let's talk about Butler buildings again. But anyway, this is the interior. I've told them that light is going to be useless for viewing a model railroad, and we need something better. And next slide. So there's going to be room in the aisles to walk around. Next slide. And a space up above and a gallery where it can be looked at. And the professional contractor is going to install the model railroad and build the benchwork for the new sections and get track in place across them and do the wiring such that we have an automatic control system that will run the thing for exhibits. My mission is to make sure that the control system is flexible enough that we can also do local control. The Beals had individual panels in a lot of locations to run the switches. And I want to keep that. And I want to keep the ability to operate it. And in fact, Seashore as an organization is hoping that we will have a group of people in the community who will come, work on the layout, maybe open it up at times when the staffer isn't available, improve the scenery, and operate it and be part of the Seashore community, that we will have a model railroad group operating out of there. And in terms of actually who is in it, the easiest way from the point of view of our insurance is if you join Seashore, which costs $40 a year, which compared with the cost of a lot of other clubs is pretty small. But if there's a group that says, no, we want to do it some other way, we can talk about it. The main thing is that if people are playing with soldering irons and circular saws and whatever else, you know, that they should, if they're doing that on Seashore's property, they need to be doing it in a way which our insurance company likes.